Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully, you have enjoyed that quick break and you are enjoying the summit so far. Now is the time that we talk about our Black Girls Equity Alliance local and state policy agenda. Really, I want to just debunk a quick myth here because sometimes I know that policy discussions may not be the most exciting. However, for us, what our policy agenda is really about is the work that is happening on the ground. And so stay tuned to hear about all of our advocacy efforts, our coalition building efforts, and our community organizing efforts, most importantly. And I am joined with our I'm joined by our Black Girls Equity Alliance work group co-conveners of all of our work groups. And so we will have Dr. Brittany Brinkman once again, Jose Garth, who leads the Health and Wellness work group with Dr. Brinkman, Tawanda Clark Edgall and Angie Steele, who both lead the Child Welfare work group, Dr. Amanda Cross and Janine Fiorina Cody, both who do our education work group, and Dr. Sarah Goodkind, as well as Sarah Nevels, who will be talking to us about our juvenile justice efforts. And once again, my name is Tashara Halyard. So let's talk very quickly about some background about how our policy agenda got started. Here's what we know: that we need to center the voices and the work of Black girls, gender expansive youth, youth with disabilities, etc. We need to ensure that we are collecting data from an inclusive intersectional lens and also have transparent practices as well. And so at the helm or the start of the Black Girls Equity Alliance, we have always been data driven in our work. Many of those initial researchers are actually with us today, like Dr. Sarah Goodkind and Brittany Brinkman. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you all, our federal agenda was released in 2021 at the start of the Biden-Harris administration. And we decided that we wanted to do the same thing on a local and a state level. Before we kicked things off, what we actually did was a series of interviews for folks who were on the line. You may have been some of those individuals who we had the pleasure of speaking with about the work that needed to be done, what was being done, what shouldn't have been done, what could have been done. We had a full exploratory conversation because we wanted to ensure that the policy agenda really reflected what is happening on the ground and the needs of our youth, most importantly. And with that in mind, we also conducted a youth survey to collect data from them about what they found to be most important and what they wanted to change and how we could map that up to public policies in our jurisdiction. Overall, what I will say is that the policy agenda is really a collective roadmap for change. And so whether or not you're a part of the Black Girls Equity Alliance, we do hope that you find the resource to be useful and edifying, and we will get deeper into each section in just a bit. So now I want to talk to Jose Garth and also Dr. Brittany Brinkman about the health and wellness section. So the way that this conversation will go, you all, is that the work group co-conveners are going to talk you through the recommendations that are in the policy agenda, and they also are going to let you know a bit about their efforts that are underway currently. So I see Brittany has come on camera. I will transition to you.
All right, thank you. So with the Health and Wellness Group, we have really tried to think about this holistically, and what does it mean? What is wellness? What is health? And not just sort of getting stuck into kind of classic buckets of that. But there have been some areas that we have really honed in on doing projects around for the last few years. So one of these is really addressing mental health and wellness. And we know that our young people do not have adequate access to mental health care, kind of period. But in particular, an approach to healing-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive mental health. And in the videos this morning, this was one of the topics that the emerging leaders talked about, was the importance of having counselors in school, and not just any counselor, right, but a counselor who understands them, who is culturally responsive, and is supportive, and not just one person everyone's supposed to get along with. But this is definitely a need. So one of the things that we've worked on in the group is collaborating with a partner, DramaWorks, to provide some culturally responsive training to teachers and other educators, to at least have some basic framework of understanding how to think about mental health from a culturally responsive lens. But certainly we need way more. We need more resources in schools, and we need a whole different framework, right? As Dr. Morris talked about, we need a mind shift away from punitive approaches to healing and restorative approaches. So this has been part of our policy agenda, is really thinking about what do we need from a policy perspective to make this happen, right? So, I think policy does inform mindset, right? But also policies are what usually grant access to on the ground resources. Where are the coins going? Where is the money going? Who are we funding? Are we paying to have police in schools, or are we paying to have mental health counselors in schools? Are we paying to make sure that all educators are getting appropriate training? So part of our policy agenda is really about increasing this access through a number of streams, not just within schools, right? We know that after school supports and organizations that provide in-school support are essential too. But making sure that that young people have access to these resources.
Yeah, so the other thing that we've really been focused on is comprehensive sex ed. We've been working on it for a number of years now, and yesterday was a huge win for us as Pittsburgh Public Schools adopted the adopted policy that we put forth as a group, which gets me really excited about our next steps and our next work. We won't get too deep into it today, but we're going to have a deeper dive tomorrow in person. We get to see all your smiling faces in person. But the thing about not just the health and wellness group, but I feel a lot of what centers this work and this policy agenda and just the work overall, the Black Girls Equity Alliance, is bringing the humanity back to what we're doing, right? Remembering that youth are human beings, no matter what their identities, what intersectional identities are, like we are dealing with human beings. And that's a place that I feel sex ed does a really good job of getting to, right? Of dealing with these very universal pieces of people's humanity and human experience, right? We all have bodies, all of our bodies change, we all have relationships, we all communicate, we all have emotions, and diving into that is really, really important. And of course, as part of that as well, we need to make sure that we're recognizing those intersectional identities as well, and recognizing that, we can't kind of equate intersectionalities with these monoliths, right? Like, oh, well, you're a Black queer girl. Here's a Black queer girl. That it's like, it can inform how we start to approach something, but doesn't take away from the fact that we need to actually build real relationships with students in order for things to be as effective as possible. So really working towards that cultural shift through policy, because as Dr. Brinkman mentioned, these policies really can kind of change the conversation and the movement and the culture behind it, right? And that's one of the things that we're really looking for, is like, how do we make sure we have these sex education mandates? That's what we're pushing with Pittsburgh Public Schools. Like, let's put this in writing. Let's make sure that every single person who's doing sex ed within the school knows that within this written policy, we are looking at anti-racism. We are looking at these other issues that are coming into our schools and that are just a part of this human experience that our youth are having. And we're looking larger than that into the state, because honestly, if some of these bills get passed that they're trying to push through on a state level, it will tip the scales in the other direction, no matter what our local policy is. If the state's like, well, you can't talk about sexual orientation, that clashes these two policies against each other. And then beyond that, nationally, if there's no mandate for this nationally, we're seeing this. We're seeing the worst side of this playing out right now with Roe v. Wade, right? We're seeing that when there's not a codified way to protect people's rights, with no protection, the harm can be done, and we can see it happening right now. The harm has been done. So trying to just keep all these this micro and macro kind of lens with these policies is really important, and in just this work in general. And as part of this piece around how do we actually holistically approach how we're educating kids around sexuality, recognizing these very basic needs that human beings have, right? We want to only often, when I say we, I mean as a society or culture, we seem to really only want to focus on the positive, clean, beautiful parts of things. Like we talk about love, we talk about, love at first sight, but we don't talk about the work behind. Well, we don't talk about the the movement behind that. And we talk about health, the same thing. Like we want like, oh, just eat right, and then we don't give any of the tools for that. So we just went through a pandemic. Not sorry, I apologize. Let me think. We are going through a pandemic currently, and just basic things like proper hand washing stations inside of the schools, right? Understanding that one of the most basic ways we can prevent the spread of viruses and bacteria is just good hand washing stations. As someone who's had to work in Pittsburgh public schools a long time, the kids don't even have proper hand washing stations, right? You have to, it's the kind of faucet you have to hold the faucet on and put one hand under, and then I don't know if anybody's ever experienced trying to wash your hands like that. It's not the sanitary way to do that. And then beyond that, actually acknowledging the fact that a good portion of the youth inside of middle school and high school menstruate, and that they need menstrual products, right? We don't have to bring our own toilet paper into the bathroom because we understand that we defecate sometimes and have to wipe our hands, right? But for some reason that doesn't translate into other very normal bodily functions such as menstruation, and making sure that we have pads and tampons available for our youth, especially those that might not be able to afford or have access to. And we know that a lot of folks that do menstruate are missing school sometimes because they don't have what they need to be able to go through a school day as far as sanitary products go. So we've had this big one with Pittsburgh Public Schools recently. We will certainly celebrate that, but also the battle continues, right? We're looking at implementation now. We're looking at these other pieces as well, and I'm hopeful that we're going to keep on having successes, but also I'm very realistic in the fact that like this is lifelong work that we're going to have to continue to do. And I'm glad to have such great co-conspirators and collaborators in this, because this Equity Alliance is a force to be reckoned with. Let me tell you. So we have all these statistics that show the inequities, but know that we are equalizing as a group, day by day, step by step.
Thank you to you both Dr. Brittany Brinkman and Jose Garth. I have to say that I'm always just so impressed, and my heart beams with pride at your activism. Since the day we met, it has been locked and loaded, and that has been so apparent in the recent win. So thank you. Now let's move forward to talk about education, and we have Dr. Amanda Cross here, who is going to lead us through the recommendations that elucidate the work that we have been doing in our education work group. Dr. Cross. You are muted, sorry.
Thank you so much. I'm going to talk about the education work group and our work over the BGAA. I am the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Office of Child Development at the University of Pittsburgh, and have been the co-convener of the education work group for the last several years. So when we started the education work group, we started with talking to girls. We had researchers engaged then, speaking with girls, ACWUN's girls, about their experiences in the school system with their education, and a lot of the issues that the girls elevated were related to safety, feelings of threats that came from both peers and staff and the system itself, how it responded to their behavior, their needs, and feeling that that was an unsafe place for them to be. And so our orientation as we've moved through the education work group has really been on increasing safety. And the major agenda items that we have are all truthfully related to suspension and discipline in schools, because we see such a huge disproportionate use of exclusionary punitive discipline against Black girls. While Black girls are not suspended at the highest rates among demographic groups, they are disproportionately suspended more. Their disproportionate suspension magnitude is higher than that for Black boys and white boys. They're 4 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. While in the most recent year at Pittsburgh Public Schools, that figure was more like 2.8 times for Black boys versus white boys. So a lot of the effort has been related to reducing suspensions in various ways. And one of those advocacy efforts was the direct suspension ban that was forwarded by a large group of advocates, including 1PA and including Gwen's Girls in 2017, and was successfully passed at Pittsburgh Public to stop suspensions of our very youngest kids from grades K through 2. So it is now prohibited in Pittsburgh Public Schools to suspend those kids in those grades for nonviolent offenses. There was a dramatic decline in suspensions for nonviolent offenses in those grades after the passing of that ban, although it was not, those suspensions were not eliminated. But we didn't find any decrease in the disproportionate suspension of Black children in that suspension. And so, as Dr. Kathy reminds us all the time, if you're not going to use a gender or racially responsive intervention, you can't expect to see gender or racially responsive results. And that's a lesson we learn again here with the suspension ban. But we're also looking to expand that ban, as we know that it was successful in reducing overall suspensions, which is good in itself, in K through 5. So an effort to do so in PPS did not pass in 2021, but we continue to work and advocate and hope to see that ban pass in the future. We'll also like to see restorative practices used more in disciplinary efforts in schools. There was a well-known study, randomized control trial in Pittsburgh Public Schools that found that restorative practices were successful to some degree in reducing suspensions and to some degree in reducing racial disparities. But moreover than the restorative practices approach, overall, we want to see more caring and less punishment. So when students are disruptive or when they're not following rules, we really want to see schools that are caring for those students and finding ways to look for the root causes of those problems, what support students might need in order to have a better experience in school. How can the school climate be improved in order to improve the experience for all students in that school? And related to school climate, we are advocating and have been for a long time across different groups here at BGEA to eliminate school dress codes, as we know that those are much more strictly enforced against girls, and particularly Black girls. We have heard countless accounts of girls being excluded from education because of what they're wearing. And when schools send the message to girls that their bodies are a problem or their bodies are distracting to other students, it promotes body shaming and an idea that somehow girls need to be hidden. And that's absolutely not the message that we want to send. Everybody in school is responsible for their own conduct. Your conduct should not be dependent on what your classmate has on. And we want to see schools really looking to understand the ramifications of what those school dress codes do in shaming girls and excluding girls for what they're wearing, how that affects a person's experience in school and their bonding to school and their classmates, and how school climate can really be improved if we don't look at how students appear in their bodies in school. So we're asking that schools really look at those dress codes and eliminate them to the extent possible. PPS and our work has really reformed their dress code to be more specific in addressing the dress code shouldn't body shame students and shouldn't target students because of their gender expression. And that's wonderful, but there also is a clause in there that principals can enforce dress codes as they see fit. So then that's opening the door, of course, then to disparities in enforcement. And it's not just PPS, of course, that we're asking to look at these codes, but across different regional school districts to really take a look and reform those dress codes and try to take that strict enforcement and that kind of disproportionate enforcement against girls and girls of color in particular, and eliminate those pressures. And then finally, we're asking to establish culturally and developmentally appropriate school codes of conduct, which envelops everything that we've just talked about, to look at a multicultural approach to conduct and how school can be and decenter whiteness in that process. And one of those ways to do so is to look at policies that we know cause disproportionate discipline against girls of color. And one of those in PPS, as another example, was disorderly conduct. And I think we'll hear more about disorderly conduct and its implications for the juvenile justice system from the juvenile justice work group. But within the school suspension world, we're seeing that disorderly conduct code was very vague and wasn't clear enough about what was happening in a conduct that caused the suspension, and it was disproportionately used against students of color. There was an advocacy effort again, the ACLU involved in that, and that was repealed. You can no longer suspend a student for disorderly conduct in Pittsburgh public schools. Schools are being asked to be more specific now about what the conduct was that caused the suspension. And though we can't say causally, but racial disparities in suspensions have reduced in Pittsburgh public schools since that code was eliminated. So we do see encouraging evidence that our advocacy work is effective in working to chip away at those disproportionate exclusionary suspension policies in our schools. And we ask anybody who's interested to join this work. We'd happy to bring you in and move forward with these agenda items looking to increase school safety and decrease punitive discipline in schools.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cross. And I just want to pin something that you mentioned about the subjectivity and things like dress codes, disorderly conduct citations. When school actors, administrators, et cetera, teachers have the ability to use their own discretion to come up with certain disciplinary measures or exclusionary infractions, it's not about the individual. I mean, we know what the science around implicit bias says. In those moments of subjectivity is when we are most likely to lean into our biased thinking and norms. And so we should definitely be concerned about those practices. And I'm so happy that we are continuing to find ways to advocate for greater equity in our schools. Before we move on, I did want to bring up Janine, who is the newest co-convener of the education work group, just to share a bit as well, especially given her background as a master teacher in PPS and beyond. Janine, we'll turn it to you.
Thank you, and thanks for that little caveat there. I am brand new to this group and so honored to be a part of it, still absorbing a lot. And I'm sort of a connector, sort of a bridge, as it were, between research and practice. That's always been my role since I spent the majority of 30 years in buildings, in classrooms, and as a teacher in Pittsburgh Public Schools. And I just want to sort of amplify, first of all, the Gala Girls' experiential expertise, and say that everything that we heard, Laura, and I'm not going to I have their names written down, but I'm not going to pull them up because I'm a little stressed. Everything we heard them say is supported by volumes of research, both done by people here and across the country and the world about what we do in practice in schools, classroom practices that exclude, that humiliate, that are punitive, that silence those that we're there to serve. And I don't want to for a minute say that I'm blaming teachers for this. They weren't properly trained to do these things. They're following a long tradition of compliance and punishment that they themselves probably are replicating from their own experiences as students. There's a better way to do these things. And the science of learning and development has a lot to teach us. And I think that it's our job, and I would love to do more work directly with PPS on this, in actually showing teachers and training teachers in practices that counter the tradition of compliance and silence and shaming as a way to teach in the tradition that excludes girls, that excludes people of color, that excludes anybody who speaks up to create that sort of righteous or critical pushback. Those are our leaders. Those are the people who we need to be elevating and teaching to do that, and use it for good, as was said earlier. And instead, we're throwing them out into the hallway. I think that, I thought since the 1990s when I began as a teacher in Hazelwood at Gladstone, I thought that was wrong, and knew that in my bones that it was wrong. But now I think I have the experience and I've worked with enough people who are involved in the neurobiology of stress and learning to actually start talking about what practices we can implement in place of those to eliminate the harm that that exacerbates stress that students are already bringing into the classroom from their own lives, but then we are adding to and exacerbating that stress, shutting off their ability to use any of the executive functions necessary for learning, any of the dispositions necessary to take a risk publicly and learn and feel you're part of a community and have a voice. So many of the practices that are the tradition shut that down. So what does it look like to do it differently? And that's what I'm hoping to somehow start to build a relationship with teachers to try to implement. And I think once they see the result, not only in the engagement, but also in their own relationships and the achievement that will necessarily skyrocket in the engagement, success will sell those new practices and hopefully eliminate some of the generational practices that they've just picked up and used well in a well-intentioned way in their own classrooms. Thank you for the opportunity to add.
Of course. And I love how you so succinctly say we want to end the culture of silence and compliance. So thank you for that. And one of your biggest fans is in the chat. Ironically, it happens to be Jose Garth. I remember the moment that you realized that you knew one another. Everybody was crying at the end of a work group because you were a teacher who he says changed his life. And Jose says, Janine is my hero, y'all. She is the teacher that taught me through her practice that a caring adult can make a huge difference in a person's life. And I just remember.
Don't make me cry again. Don't make me cry again.
Listen, you're in a safe space. If you were moved to it, we understand and we hold you close because that is the work. And we are grateful not only for the connection, but also in real time that you all embody the very thing that our youth said this morning, right? About the importance of relationship in and outside of the school building. So thank you, Janine, and to the education work group as a whole for keeping the work going. Now we are talking about the same young people, y'all. Right? We separate our work for the purposes of us because it helps us to stay organized, but these are the same exact young people. And with that said, we're going to hop over to the child welfare work group as far as our child welfare work recommendations are concerned. And we have Ms. Tawanda Clark-Edgall, who's actually going to take my seat, as well as Angie Steele. So we will start with Tawanda. Oh, we're going to start with Angie? Here, Miss Tawanda is going to come here, and then she and Angie will take the mic.
Okay. All right, great. I'm glad to have everybody here at the 7th Annual Equity Summit. We've done a lot of work this year with the Child Welfare Work Group. One of the things that we definitely recognize, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tawanda Clark-Edgall. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at Gwynn's Grills. But prior to that, I've had a history of over 25 years in child welfare in 2 different states, both New York and also in Pennsylvania. And I like to say that my forte is older child adoption, making sure that older people, young people, stay connected to forever families. When we started doing this work, probably in 2016, and Angie can correct me with the data, when we really started looking at the numbers, and what we saw was that our Black girls were more likely to go into institutional types of living, congregate care settings. And we were really quite surprised when we looked at that data initially, because that was not at all what we thought was the case. And since that, we've really been taking a deep dive in how do we improve the outcomes. And we know that the county has worked very directly and has really tried to mitigate some of the challenges that surround that. One of the things that we know from looking at this work is that there is disproportionality in the child welfare system. And so the state really has recognized that on some level and understands that we do need to do some anti-bias training. To what level they're going to do it, we're not sure, but we are certainly nudging them. And in the interim, what our work group has been doing is really trying to support the community in understanding what it's like when a child is removed, because we have so much of the over-reporting. It really can be just as detrimental to a young person to be moved from their home when they don't have to be, as it is for a young person who is in an unsafe condition. So we have really been trying to do these educational blasts to help our community understand the difference between what is in fact a safety threat, what puts a child in harm's way, and what might be a situation of poverty or a cultural difference, something that through no fault of that child or that family, they've been in a situation where they've intersected with the child welfare system. So we've looked at that. What we know is that children belong in families, safe, nurturing families. And we know that children have, I will always say, and Kevin Campbell will say more, but we know that they have a mother's side of the family and a father's side of the family. And that doesn't count the churches that they may belong to, the communities that they belong to. And so in those events where their parents are becoming well to care for them and they can't stay in the home with their parents, we really want to make sure that our child welfare organizations, child serving organizations, are looking for family members for those children to be with. And in the event that that doesn't happen, we are never going to say that a child should stay in any kind of a congregate care placement or group home setting. But we want to make sure that we're providing the supports and the services that are needed ongoing to families that adopt outside of their race. Okay, and Angie, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you add to that. Tashira and I are sharing our space together. So.
And Angie, I want to make sure that we can hear you and see you. So give me just one moment. I am promoting you to panelist. And once you accept, feel free to unmute yourself and come on camera to share with us the rest of the recommendations.
I think I'm here. Now I look on. Okay.
You're like magic. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Oh, there's my video. Okay. So really, Twanda did an excellent job summarizing the work that we've been doing in child welfare. Like she mentioned, we've been doing work within the agency for we're coming up on a decade now, and have made a lot of improvements. But one of the first things that we've noticed, when we're looking at our data and when we're looking at outcomes for children, is that our greatest area of disproportionality is what's coming in our front door. So I didn't bring a whole deck of data. I know that's unusual for me, but we know that even if we do all the work we can within our agency, we still have to stop the disparity that's coming in our front door, because that's impacting our children. So like Twanda said, we want the state legislature to require and fund anti-bias training. We do see some agencies, some providers, some other smaller groups that are taking the lead and having these anti-bias trainings. But we do know how much it costs, and that without a requirement, it often does go by the wayside with all of the competing things that our mandated reporters have to do. With that, we wanted to focus not only on our community organizations and our providers, but also community organizations that are smaller. So not to take away from the expertise and the functioning of the agencies that we generally contract with, but we know that grassroots organizations really have a foothold in the communities, understand our families, and are able to provide more culturally responsive child welfare services. So again, that's something that we're starting here in Allegheny County, but we definitely need to grow and have this normalized throughout the state. Twanda talked about kinship, and kinship is incredibly important. We know culturally, just ties with families, those kinds of things, that kinship is the best placement for any child. Over the last decade, we had made significant increases in our placement with kinship for our Black children in particular, and actually we're able to close the gap in disparities. But we are starting to see some changes over the last few years. So while we're keeping our finger on it within the agency, we need to make sure that all of the barriers to kinship are being taken away. So barriers like consideration of criminal histories. We know our criminal justice system is very disproportionate, so that would impact the families that are coming to us for kinship care services. Financial support, even concrete goods like beds and clothes and furniture, you know, those kinds of things to really be able to stabilize a family, stabilize a kinship care placement, and give them the supports to access resources that they may need as well. And then we touched on transracial adoption in our agency a couple of years ago, and it is certainly a need that we have recognized across our agency as well as the state and the country. We often see transracial adoptions, which are not supported. So we see transracial adoptions both ways, Black children with white families, white children with Black families, but we often drop these children off, tell the families to figure it out, and it doesn't lead to really good outcomes for our children. So human service agencies, either by delivering the services directly or making sure that it is part of the contracting for our foster care agencies, is of utmost importance. And it's not just training, it's not just talking about culture, it's having experiences, it's learning how to do hair and skin products and really understanding the children that we are taking care of in our homes. So like Tawanda said, some of the things that we're working on is educating the community, educating our mandated reporters about what CYF is, what we do, what we don't do. We see a lot of people come to CYF because they're frustrated. They don't know where to go. They don't know what resources they are. And people really do want to do what's best for kids. I argue that unless there is significant neglect or abuse, CYF is not the best option. But what do we do for our mandated reporters so they have different options so that kids aren't coming to our front door in the first place if they don't need to? This is not to say don't call if there's concerns. We certainly want to continue to do our job, but things like, you know, families just needing resources, or a child may not have a coat, or those kinds of things. Where can our mandated reporters call before calling our system? How can we get them to think about the reports that they're making and think about their biases in these reports before they actually make the phone call? So that's the work we're doing. Are there any questions?
Yes, so we did have one question, Angie, and it's for folks who may not be aware of the mandated reporter training. Can you just tell us what is a mandated reporter, and then what is the required training that we are working to influence and to shape?
Sure. So a mandated reporter is someone who comes into contact with a child through their through their employment. So we commonly think of doctors and teachers as mandated reporter. It's recently been expanded to clergy, people who come into contact with children. We have a mandated reporter training that each person has to go through every 5 years. And through that training, they teach you what constitutes abuse and neglect, how to contact the agency, how to make a report. They do have a bit in there about diversity, but we would like to bolster that into more of an anti-racist section, which is work that's being done. But it is the basis that our mandated reporters go on to figure out whether they should report or should not.
Okay, thank you. And Tawanda has some follow-ups to that.
Sure.
Right. And Angie, thank you for saying that. I think it's really important to highlight too. It does, cover some portions on diversity, some portions on poverty. But the sections I think could definitely be amplified to speak a little bit louder than what they do in the curriculum. What does speak loudly in the curriculum and what most people hear, and we're not saying anything against this, but is that if you know something, you should say something because you're a mandated reporter, but also you're reprimanded for not reporting. And I think that is where the challenge comes in, because people are afraid of the repercussions. So even if it may not be something that is reportable, they go ahead and they report anyway from fear of what the repercussions might be. So let me give you an example. If we're talking about a child maybe in the winter because they come from another country, not knowing that it's as cold as it is here in America, and maybe they don't have socks on. This is, you know, a story that we've heard in our group. And so a report is made based on that. Well, that's more cultural, might be poverty. That's not necessarily a child that's, you know, at risk for any kind of safety. But if a report is made for that, you know what I mean? There are areas there where we need to give a little bit more information, and people need to know that if they've been able to mitigate the problem or rectify it, it doesn't still warrant a report. And I think that's where the confusion comes in, because people hear, I'm a mandated reporter, I need to report this or I'll be reprimanded. So I think that's what speaks volumes to what people are learning in the training.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then there are a couple examples of mandated reporters being held criminally liable for not reporting. I believe there were 2 in Pennsylvania since the change that happened back in 2015. But it's 2. And people hold on to that and believe that, you know, if they don't call in every single thing, then they're going to have that same fate. And it's hard to fight against that when you see that it has happened to others.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what I have heard your work group say continuously, especially as people who are either agency employees or former agency employees, just discerning, concerned adults, is that we're not saying don't make the report. We're saying make an informed decision before making the report. Yeah. And to work to mitigate and to call out one's own biases. So thank you to Tawanda and to Angie. Angie has been part of our work group for a very long time, and also See the Best in Me awardee from last year. So congrats again. We couldn't celebrate you in person.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Angie. So now we are going to wrap up this discussion with the Juvenile Justice Work Group. We are going to hear from Dr. Sarah Goodkind, and also wrap up with Sarah Nevels, who is going to chat with us about our new pre-diversion work. But before we get there, let's go to Dr. Sarah Goodkind. Let me pull you up. Okay, all you, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you all today, and I've really been enjoying this update from all of the work groups, and especially hearing about the important impact that the Black Girls Equity Alliance has had. As Tashira said, I'm Sarah Goodkind. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh, and I've been co-convening this work group with Kim Booth since the beginning, and it's been a delight to work with Kim all these years. And I don't know if she's here today, but I'm sure she can add and correct things that I miss if she is. Tashira mentioned earlier that the work that we've been doing has begun with the data by trying to understand what's happening locally, and taking an intersectional perspective in that work, as we always have. And Dr. Monique Morris talked earlier about the push out from schools and into the systems. And that's really what we've seen when we started looking at the local data with regard to juvenile justice involvement, is that, just like Angie said for child welfare, the most significant problems and the most significant racial and gender disproportionality are with regard to the front end of the system, referrals of Black girls to the juvenile justice system. And one thing that we've seen from the very beginning with the data is not just that the racial disproportionality for girls, for Black girls compared with white girls, is worse than for Black boys compared with white boys, just like Amanda was talking about with regard to suspensions from schools. But also we compared our local data with national data, and we've seen that juvenile justice referrals for Black youth, both girls and boys, are at a higher rate in Allegheny County than Black youth nationally. at the same time that juvenile justice referrals for white youth in Allegheny County, again, both girls and boys, are lower than the national averages for white girls and boys, respectively. So what that's told us is that we know how to not refer young people to the juvenile justice system. The behavior of white and Black youth in Allegheny County is no different than that nationally, right? In terms of the things you could refer young people to juvenile justice for. So we know how to avoid referring white youth, and we need to get a lot better at not referring Black youth into the system. So we've been taking a systemic approach to this work. And one thing that we're really excited about that you can see as the first recommendation in this policy agenda is for the Department of Human Services to follow through on implementing countywide practices that divert young people from the legal system. And what we've had diversion here before, but it's been post-arrest diversion after young people have been arrested. And what we're really excited about is that now we have a pre-arrest diversion program that is just beginning for young people in Allegheny County. And that's what Sarah Nevels is going to talk more about later. So I won't say more about that, but I will say that Gwen's Girls is coordinating that, and it's something that we can all help and support. So that's one thing that will make a huge difference. Our second recommendation is for the state legislature to prohibit the imposition of fees and fines for young people and their families because of their legal system involvement. And so this is also a recommendation that comes from our comprehensive look at the data. We see that many young people in Allegheny County, especially Black youth, are receiving summary citations, often in schools. In some of our previous reports, we've explained more about that. Summary citations are supposed to be for kind of lesser behaviors that you wouldn't be arrested for. But part of the issue is that then young people are fined. So it could be for smoking or drinking or something like that. They're issued a fine. If they don't pay that fine, then they are referred often by the magistrate judges into the juvenile justice system. And we have really high rates of referrals of Black youth for failure to pay fines. And this is something that could be changed. We don't need to be fining young people for these behaviors. And again, we know that this has a disproportionate impact on families in poverty because wealthier families can just pay those fines if their young people are fined, whereas we end up criminalizing poverty with what's happening. So that's our second recommendation. And the third recommendation, again, based on the data, is that we need school boards across Allegheny County to prohibit referrals to law enforcement for disorderly conduct. And we already talked a little bit about this today, but one thing we've seen is that many arrests and referrals to juvenile justice from schools, especially for Black girls, have been for disorderly conduct. This is a discretionary catch-all kind of offense. And we know that racial biases play into this in a huge way. So we're making some progress on that, as we heard in Pittsburgh Public Schools, but we have a way to go with that as well. So those are our recommendations. We also have been wanting, our work group has been looking at what's been happening with juvenile justice referrals when our young people have not been in school for part of the pandemic, right? There was a time when many young people were learning mostly from home. And because referrals of Black girls to juvenile justice in our county have overwhelmingly come from the schools, we thought this was important to kind of track what's been happening. This slide kind of reminds you that in our last report from the Juvenile Justice Work Group, we found that, again, school-based arrests and referrals for discretionary offenses like disorderly conduct, as well as referrals for failure to pay fines associated with summary citations, again, most of which were really minor discretionary behaviors, were what were accounting for the really high and disproportionate rates of referral of Black girls to juvenile justice in our county. And so we've started to take a look at the data, and we have a new kind of update 2-page sheet. I think that Tashira is going to drop that PDF in the chat, but we were going to share on the next slide a couple of graphs that show what's happened. All right, so this is the question we asked. What happened when many students were not attending school in person during the pandemic? And we have looked at 2019, 2020, and 2021 data. And we, of course, will add 2022 when that's available. But what we've seen overall, the juvenile justice referrals in Allegheny County have dropped, especially referrals of Black girls, which have decreased by over 60%. So then we asked ourselves, okay, well, let's break up those overall referrals and look at non-school-based referrals versus the referrals that are coming from schools. So this next slide shows the non-school related referrals. Again, these dropped for all groups, as you can see here. And again, the largest drop for Black girls. But what we see on the next slide when we looked at school related referrals is that in fact, these dropped even more significantly. Again, especially for Black students, with the most significant drop being for Black girls. So they dropped by 83%. If we could go to the next slide. We also looked at the referrals to juvenile justice for failure to pay fines for summary citations. Again, huge decreases during these last few years during the pandemic, with most significant decreases for girls in this case, both Black and white. If we could go to the next. So we wanted to look, we've been talking a lot about racial disproportionality. So we calculate rates of referral by the size of the population. And what we've seen is that during this time when referrals overall have decreased for all groups, the rate of racial disproportionality for boys has stayed the same. So Black boys in our county are 7 times more likely to be referred to juvenile justice than white boys. But the referral rate for girls has decreased a little bit. It's still higher than for boys, right? So it was 10 times in 2019. Now it is 8 times. So Black girls are 8 times more likely to be referred to juvenile justice than white girls in our county. Not acceptable at all, but glad that it is decreasing. And we have, I think, just one more graph to show you. As I talked about before, we have been comparing what's happening in Allegheny County with national rates. This is just, so there isn't national data yet, even for 2021. So this is just 2020. But again, comparing the Allegheny County rates with US rates, we see that our referral rates for Black boys and girls remain higher locally than nationally, and for white boys and girls lower than national. And so again, the national rates have dropped in a really similar pattern to our county rates and what we plan to look at next. If we could go to the next slide, please, is to try to understand what will happen now that most young people are back in school. So as we just note here, right, there were huge decreases. A huge part of this is because many students were not physically in schools. And as we've been talking about all day today, we need to be implementing restorative practices in schools, increasing the availability of and access to mental health supports, and instituting pre-arrest diversion initiatives like we are here. And I believe now I am going to turn it over to Sarah Nevels.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you for always just keeping the rally cry strong, mining all of the data and reminding us of the work that has been done, but the work yet to be done. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah Nevels to have the last word. We like to say that we don't want to present problems without probable and possible solutions. And so we are now at the solution portion of our presentation. Sarah, what you know good? Tell us the good news.
Exactly. I am very pleased to be able to present the solution. We're very excited here at Gwen's Girls to tell you about a new program that will be starting. We'll actually be going live with 211 next week. This is that pre-arrest diversion program that Sarah Goodkind had referred to. It is Caring Connections for Youth. And our goal is to reduce disparities of juvenile justice involvement with our Black youth in Allegheny County. So the BGA work group, specifically the Juvenile Justice Work Group, sought to address problems such as issues with the prison pipeline, the school to prison pipeline, school pushout, lack of trust in law enforcement, access to services, lack of mental health services, lack of trained professionals, and a system disconnected from the communities that it serves. So we are partnering with a diverse network of traditional resources, but more importantly, non-traditional, informal and grassroots supports and resources and organizations. So as I said, we go live next week with 211, which means people will be able to call 211. And when I say people, this is community-based organizations and supports, parents, youth themselves, police officers, school personnel, probation, magistrates, and any other youth serving entities or programs or agencies will be able to call 211. It'll be a 24-hour centralized intake and be connected to our navigators who will then assist them with a needs assessment, looking at, again, this is about the family. This is not what we think you need, but what the family tells us they need. And looking at what we can connect them to, both informal and those non-traditional supports, and then very strong follow-up that will stay connected with them and the supports that are put in place to resolve whatever issues brought them to call 211. This will be available for all youth in Allegheny County. We will have some target communities, which include Pittsburgh East, Pittsburgh South, and the West End, and those areas include Braddock, East Pittsburgh. We will have Mon Valley and McKeesport, which will include Duquesne, Clariton, and all of those outlining areas, and then Penn Hills. So again, those are our target communities, but we will serve all youth in Allegheny County, and they will be connected to, again, that network of supports within the community, very community-based agencies. There will be case management and follow-up, as well as training for those network agencies that are involved with us, and lots of support. So over the next 2 years, we hope to we are going to increase access to pre-arrest services that reduce the number of youth involved in systems, a reduction in the number of juveniles referred to juvenile court, citations, arrests, and suspensions, and a significant reduction in or complete elimination of the racial disparities seen in the referrals to the Allegheny County Juvenile Justice System. So again, we go live next week. It will be 211, and it is called Caring Connections for Youth.
Thank you, Sarah. And Sarah, you have a question here. What is the age range for Caring Connections for Youth?
All youth to about 18, but we are even going to take calls for a little bit older than that, because we know that there's that transition period and that not all youth necessarily finish high school at 18. Sometimes it's 19.
Very true. And also Erica says, super proud of you. We've been on this journey together.